Today we commemorate the end of what I believe we should call the Asia-Pacific War, not the Pacific War. This is not simply a question of word choice. It really represents a fundamental conceptual change of how we look at this tremendous event in American and world history. If we recognize this event as the Asia-Pacific War, then we can truly understand that ending the war was truly a miraculous deliverance from one of the greatest tragedies in human history. And to understand and above all to judge these events, we must follow two principles. The first is to count all the dead, and the second is to treat all the dead as sharing a common humanity. With these 2 points in mind, let me pose to you the following question. We will come back to this later and see if you would change your mind. The Asia-Pacific War commenced in July 1937 when China began sustained resistance against Japanese aggression. It would end officially 8 years and 1 month later in August 1945. It was a war of immense scale, now seldom recognized. After starting in China, it would explode west to India, south to what's now Indonesia, east to the Hawaiian Islands, and north to the Aleutian Islands in the northeast corner of Asia. Within this span, which I call the Arc of Asia, there lived over 1 billion people, which was literally half the population of the globe at that time. At the zenith of Japan's imperial reach, she had about 516 million people under her control, or over 20% of the world's population. At the maximum extent of Hitler's conquests, he had about 360 million people under his heel, or about 14% of the world's population. More than halfway through the Asia-Pacific War, Japan attacked the US and our allies in December 1941. And we've called that part of the war the Pacific War. But in reality, the Pacific War was simply a subpart of the Asia-Pacific War. And two words define the basic difference between the Asia-Pacific War and the Pacific War: the dead. By conservative counting, the Asia-Pacific War resulted in the deaths of about 25 million human beings, of whom about 6 million were combatants, mostly Japanese and Chinese. That leaves 19 million non-combatant deaths. So how many of them were Japanese? Well, using a generous accounting, the number of dead Japanese non-combatants reached about 1 million to about 1.2 million. That tells us immediately by the math that for every Japanese non-combatant who died, some 17 or 18 other non-combatants perished. They were overwhelmingly other Asians, about 12 or 12 million of them were Chinese. Or phrased another way, almost 95% of all the non-combatants who died in the Asia-Pacific War were not Japanese. Excluding the Japanese, every single day the war was continuing in the summer of 1945. Somewhere between 8,000 and 14,000 non-combatants who were not Japanese were dying. And most of those 17 or 18 million non-combatants who were not Japanese who had died in the war had already died. That amounts to about 240 to 400,000 non-combatants who were not Japanese dying every single month the war continued. By contrast, the Pacific War, the struggle basically between the US and Japan across the Pacific, produced at the outside 3 to maybe 3.5 million deaths, or about 12 to 15% of the total deaths in the Asia-Pacific War. And the Pacific War framework perversely makes it seem as though none of those 17 or 18 million non-combatant deaths who were not Japanese really counted, and makes it appear as though most of the non-combatants who died in the war were Japanese. With these numbers in mind, by the summer of 1945, the Asia-Pacific War ranked high on any scroll of history's greatest human tragedies. And that tragedy increased every day, and most of those who were dying were not Japanese. Now, before we get to the specifics of events some 75 years ago, there are a couple of elements of critical context we have to fully understand. The first of which is that the war would have to end by a decision in Tokyo as to the timing and the circumstances of that ending. But when we get to look at who was there to decide in Japan how the war would end, we should be very sobered. Japan had an incredibly dysfunctional civilian and military decision-making program. And I can't go into all the details about that, but the one essential element you need to have in mind is this. The legal government of Japan from April to the end of the war in 1945 was the government of Prime Minister Kentaro Suzuki. The real power within that government to decide was an inner cabinet called the Big Six. The Big Six consisted of 3 men who were either currently or formerly admirals, 2 generals, and 1 civilian, the foreign minister. And in accordance with Japanese cultural norms, The Big Six could only act when they had complete unanimity. 6-0 would have to be the vote, and the militarists had 5 of the 6 votes. This brings us to a rather fundamental point. Ending war with Imperial Japan required 2 basic steps. The first was that someone with legitimate authority had to decide that Japan would surrender. And then second, the fighting itself, however, would only end if Japan's armed forces complied with that decision to surrender. And now we come to Emperor Hirohito. With the Big Six, he formed the 7th man who had the real power to decide Japan's fate. But under the Japanese system, although he was divine and he was the supreme ruler, in point of fact, he was insulated from direct participation in governing of Japan in order to preserve his aura of infallibility. Since he had become emperor in 1925, Emperor Hirohito had intervened on exactly 1 occasion to directly guide Japan's future, and that was in 1936 when he moved to quell a coup d'etat attempt right in Tokyo under his nose. For him to intervene would be an extraordinary event, and certainly one that could not be easily predicted. Now, what was Japan seeking in 1945? Well, at the beginning of the year, they fully understood that their military situation was completely disastrous, but they rejected any thought of surrender. Instead, they developed a 2-step sequential policy they called Ketsugo, or Operation Decisive. Its foundation was that Japan could only achieve an end to the war that they would find satisfactory if they could change the military balance. Then and only then could they achieve by diplomacy some set of terms that they were prepared to settle for. And basically what they were looking for was preserving the old order in Japan that had created this humongous and horrendous war. Japanese leaders remained convinced that although the US had enormous material power, American morale was brittle and could be broken. And once this was achieved, Japan's leadership could then evaluate the situation and determine on what terms the war would end. All emphasis in this strategy was really on the military component until the counter-invasion battle. And that is why, basically, at no point prior to Hiroshima had the legal government of Japan, this Big Six inter-cabinet, ever decided on terms to end the war, as they conceded freely after the war. At no point had they arrived at any set of terms to end the war prior to Hiroshima. What about the emperor? Well, there's no record before Japan's surrender that at any point he conceived of terms upon which he was prepared to intervene to try to get the government to end the war. We do know that his principal advisor, a fellow named Lord Keto, had proposed to him that he should intervene in June 1945, but it was only for the purpose of encouraging the government to try to get a diplomatic initiative open using the Soviet Union as a mediator to negotiate an end to the war, not to deliver a surrender note. And when Keto set forth the terms upon which they were then contemplating how that war would end, it simply evoked the Treaty of Versailles that ended World War I. Japan might have to give up overseas territories, it might have to endure a period of disarmament, but there would be no occupation of Japan, and the seat of the emperor on the throne, the old order, would be preserved, putting Japan in the situation that Germany was after the Treaty of Versailles, ready to renew a conflict, perhaps with nuclear weapons, some 2 decades later. Now, we not only have no immediate evidence prior to Hiroshima that the emperor had any concept of terms to end the war. The emperor gave an important dictated statement about his whole view of the Asia-Pacific War in early 1946 in contemplation that he might be either a witness or a defendant at a war crimes trial. This was the perfect opportunity for Hirohito to say there was some American offer that could have induced him to intervene before Hiroshima. He made no such comment indicating there was anything that he was thinking about prior to Hiroshima that would have ended the war. So what was the US seeking in 1945? Well, President Franklin Roosevelt in January 1943 had set the American overall goal as the unconditional surrender of the Axis powers. Now, for our purposes, the point I want to emphasize is that unconditional surrender was the foundation upon which the plans for the occupation and reforms of Japan were based, because unconditional surrender gave the US authority to do far more than the international law of military occupation permitted. It was thus foundational to securing and enduring peace. The task of devising a military strategy to end the war on unconditional surrender fell to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, but they divided sharply between the issue of time versus casualties. The Army, led by General George C. Marshall, believed that the critical issue was time to sustain the support of the American people to end the war on unconditional surrender. And the Army believed that an invasion of the Japanese home islands was the swiftest way to end the war. The Navy, led by Admiral Ernest J. King, had literally studied the war with Japan going on 4 decades. And from that intense study, one of the most fundamental principles naval leaders had concluded was that it would be folly to attempt to invade the Japanese home islands because it would produce politically unacceptable casualties. The Navy's alternate strategy was one of bombardment by air and sea and blockade. And here I want to take you for a moment into exactly what blockade meant, because it's mentioned, but it's not really described as to what the Navy was thinking about. What blockade ultimately ended up doing was forcing a Japanese capitulation by starving to death millions of Japanese, mostly non-combatants. That was what blockade was all about. And when you understand the relative power to kill by famine or starvation versus the conventional weapons that were then available, and even the new nuclear weapons, which had not remotely the power that the later weapons would have, you can see that blockade was truly the most ruthless American strategy to end the war with Japan in 1945. Now, in April 1945, the Joint Chiefs adopted a policy paper setting forth both the strategy that they wanted to follow and the reasoning behind it. Their overall vision was that the U.S. will continue the still building campaign of blockade and bombardment until November 1945. At that point, that campaign will be merged with a 2-phase initial invasion of the Japanese home islands called Operation Downfall. The first phase of that invasion was called Operation Olympic. It was targeted on southern Kyushu with a projected date of the 1st of November 1945. The purpose of Olympic was to secure bases, primarily air bases, to support further operations for a second phase, which was called Operation Cornet, which was set for the 1st of March 1946, and it was targeted on the Tokyo area. In setting forth a rationale for that plan, the Joint Chiefs noted that there were 2 manifest obstacles to achieving unconditional surrender. The first of which was that no Japanese government have ever surrendered to a foreign power in the history of Japan, which by Japanese count was 2,600 years. And further, the Joint Chiefs noted that no Japanese unit had ever surrendered in any skirmish, battle, or campaign of the Asia-Pacific War. And that led them to make a fundamental observation about the situation. And that was that the ultimate nightmare that the U.S. was facing was not an invasion of Japan. It was the prospect that there would be no organized capitulation of Japan's government and armed forces, and the U.S. would then be left with the task, they estimated, of defeating some 5 million Japanese under arms in the home islands, on the Asian continent, and across the Pacific, which such help as our allies could provide, and for a period of time that no one could project. Now, let me move more directly to the immediate end of the war. President Harry S. Truman assumed his office on April 12th after Franklin Roosevelt died. Mr. Truman immediately announced that his mission was to execute the policies of Franklin Roosevelt. The problem that Mr. Truman soon encountered was that it was all well and good to say he intended to follow Roosevelt's policies. The problem was determining in many areas what those policies had been, because Mr. Roosevelt had played his cards, as we say, close to his vest, and even his closest advisors frequently were divided over what President Roosevelt had intended. The one area where there was no confusion was this. President Truman knew that President Roosevelt had authorized the Manhattan Project to build atomic bombs. And no one presented him with any credible evidence that Mr. Roosevelt would not have used atomic bombs when they became available, which was the operative presumption behind the entire Manhattan Project. Now, Mr. Truman called a meeting in June 18, 1945, to review the invasion plans. He did this primarily because he was shocked by the rising American casualties on Okinawa following the tremendous bloodletting on Iwo Jima. And he reluctantly gave approval to Olympic, but not to Operation Cornet. What happened then was that in July, especially the last 2 weeks, and into August 1945, Mr. Truman became aware of a stupendous Japanese buildup on southern Kyushu to meet Operation Olympic. In simple terms, rather than having an overwhelming superiority over the Japanese as planned, the new intelligence disclosed that about 380,000 American assault troops would actually be doing the fighting, would clash with somewhere over 700,000 Japanese. Now, this slide represents in simple terms the stark difference between what Operation Olympic looked like when it was planned and what it was looking like in August 1945. On the left, you see the US plan where we had overwhelming superiority in air, land, and sea. And on the right, you don't have to be a graduate of a war college to figure out that this was a clear recipe for a bloodbath going in against the number of Japanese forces that were then stationed on southern Kyushu. At the same time, intercepted Japanese diplomatic communications disclosed that the Japanese were nowhere near peace. There were a number of Japanese, what I call peace entrepreneurs, which were diplomats and some military and naval attachés in Western Europe, who presented themselves as though they represented the Japanese government seeking peace. But what the intercepts had shown, Mr. Truman was well aware, that none of these individuals had an actual sanction of the Japanese government. The only individual who actually had the sanction of the Japanese government to conduct any sort of diplomatic initiative was the Japanese ambassador in Moscow, a gentleman named Naotaki Sato. If you take Sato's cables to the foreign minister, a fellow named Shigenori Togo, and line them up, I think as a lawyer, you would say that what Sato represented was the prosecuting attorney on behalf of the Truman administration in a ruthless, relentless cross-examination exposing the complete pathos and flecklessness of Japanese diplomacy. I can't go into all of these, but the language that Sato was using just reeked with his contempt for the effort. At one point, when Togo suggests some phrases he's supposed to use to induce the Soviets to become a mediator, Sato replies by saying those phrases were, quote, pretty little phrases devoid of all connection with reality, unquote. And Sato's cables go on in that vein throughout July 1945. Now, what Sato also did was insist that the Japanese government would have to present actual terms to end the war to get the Soviets to act as a mediator. And of course, Togo can't provide terms because the Japanese government has never agreed upon terms. So what Mr. Truman, both on the diplomatic side, showing the Japanese were nowhere near peace, and on the military side, that Operation Olympic looked
Hey,
like—
Rich.
Yes?
I'm sorry, you froze there. Can you start from the beginning of that sentence?
Let me go. Let me go back here and see what. I was sort of ad-libbing along. That's why I'm struggling.
Okay. You can pick it up anywhere.
Okay, let me go back here.
Maybe just a couple of sentences.
Okay. Well, I think if you stop at the point, was I still good through when I mentioned that the Japanese government had never agreed on terms for peace?
Start from there. I think you froze right when that happened.
Right when that happened. Okay. Okay. Let me see if I can rephrase this.
Yeah. Okay. Go ahead.
I'll do it. And so basically, to summarize what we're discussing here, the basic information before Mr. Truman was the Japanese government was nowhere near any conditions to surrender to achieve peace. And secondly, that Operation Olympic, based upon the intercept showing this enormous Japanese buildup there, was looking like it was sure to be an absolute bloodbath if it were to go forward. Now, not only was that obvious from the intercepts, but he was also reading an analysis that was provided on July 27th, looking at all the intercepts, both military and diplomatic, up to that point. And in that analysis, which he was reading in the summary, it said same thing that was obvious, that Japan was nowhere near peace, the militarists were firmly in control, and that they were planning on this bloodbath at Operation Olympic. And it's in this context that Mr. Truman decides to authorize the use of atomic bombs. And on August 6, 1945, the B-29 Enola Gay drops an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. Tokyo received word that something horrendous had happened at Hiroshima, and then they monitored the broadcast from Mr. Truman saying it was an atomic bomb. The reaction to this news in Tokyo is extremely significant. And the reason for that is this: Japan had an atomic bomb program. It did not give Japan an atomic bomb, but it did educate the top level leaders in Japan on the extraordinary difficulty of producing fissionable material. Fissionable material is what makes an atomic bomb an atomic bomb. So the reaction of the key leaders was as follows. The Imperial Army would not concede that the Americans had even one atomic bomb until there was an investigation. The Imperial Navy's response was much more ominous. They said, well, the Americans may have one atomic bomb, but they can't have that many of them. They can't be that powerful. That's what this reaction shows, is that what would convince the Japanese that the bombs were a critical factor was not that the U.S. had one bomb, but the U.S. had an arsenal of powerful nuclear weapons at its disposal. And that's why the Nagasaki bomb, in fact, is so important, because it created the impression that the U.S. did, in fact, have that arsenal of powerful weapons. And the clear benchmark for this is that the war minister, General Anami, who was really the second most powerful man in Japan after the emperor, he had been adamant that the war continue after the word of Hiroshima. But after Nagasaki, he starts telling other members of the leadership that the U.S. has 100 atomic bombs and the next target may be Tokyo. So exactly how many deaths did the two atomic bombs cause? This has been controversial. The basic problems are that there was no really accurate count of how many people were in Hiroshima or Nagasaki at the time the bomb detonated. And secondly, that after the war, when there was an attempt to do a count of survivors, there was a stigma attached in Japan to anyone who'd been exposed to the bombs. And thus people were reticent about reporting that they'd actually had exposure. And this has led to a number of figures which are, I believe, much higher than the evidence really supports. Now, my estimate is that the total number of deaths, both immediately and latently due to the atomic bombs, is roughly about 210,000, which is a horrendous figure by itself. We shouldn't forget. John Dower, another historian who's worked on this, he has estimated that the number is, as he puts it, a little more than 210,000, without giving a really specific number. So basically, the two of us are very close together that is the death toll from both the bombs, both immediately and latently. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union intervened on the night of August 8th and 9th, 1945. They crushed Japanese forces in Manchuria and North Korea and occupied a big swath of northeastern Asia. Now, again, according to John Dower, a historian who wrote a book about the occupation of Japan called Embracing Defeat, the Soviets captured in their campaigns right at the end of the war between 1.6 and 1.7 Japanese nationals. When the Soviets were finished repatriating all the people that they said they held, the Japanese only counted 1.2 million who'd been returned, leaving somewhere between 400,000 and 500,000 Japanese unaccounted for. And we know from Soviet archival information that the number of those who were dead or missing forever was about 61,000 military personnel, which means that almost 340,000 to almost 440,000 of the dead due to Soviet intervention were Japanese non-combatants, civilians. Now, the first and indispensable moment in the path towards peace for Japan came when the emperor intervened. And he did so on the afternoon of August 8th, 1945, when he announced to the foreign minister that the war must end. This was after Hiroshima, but it was before the Soviet intervention. In addition, the emperor made a number of other points over the next few days, sketching out part of his reasoning. He announced that he had lost complete faith in Ketsugo, which struck directly at the whole rationale for the military command to continue the war. Secondly, he talked about the increased destructiveness of conventional and now nuclear attacks. And thirdly, he talked about what was called, in translation, the domestic situation. And this was a euphemism for the fact that Hirohito and a swath of the Japanese leadership had become really concerned that the Japanese people themselves were reaching a revolutionary state. Now, not directly in July or the first days of August, but as they look towards the fall. And you're going to hear from Dr. Kawamura. We'll tell you a good deal more about this, because she thinks this is the key reason why Emperor Hirohito decided to end the war. Now, we also have to look at another piece of powerful evidence on what the domestic situation meant in the Japanese decision to end the war. According to a contemporary diary entry of one of his aides, the Navy Minister, Admiral Yone, stated that in a way, the atomic bombs and Soviet entering the war, or as he put it, gifts from the gods, because as he said, now we don't have to admit that the real reason we are surrendering is because of the domestic situation. So this is not to say, however, that Soviet intervention played no role whatsoever in the end of the war. In fact, it proved to be a two-edged sword. When word of Soviet intervention reached Tokyo in the morning of August 9th, General Toshio Kawabe, who was effectively the #2 man on the operational side of the Imperial Army, was keeping a daily diary. And he acknowledged that he was shocked by the Soviet entry, but then he went ahead and sketched out what should be done. And what he said was that we will declare martial law throughout Japan, and if necessary, wipe out any vestige of civilian control. This would lock the country definitely on a path and towards a final battle, and definitely preclude any movement towards peace. Then, after the Soviet intervention, after the emperor announces that he wants the war to end during an imperial conference on the night of the 9th and 10th of August 1945, Kawabe's diary entry indicates that another senior officer in imperial headquarters has come to him and said that he does not think that the overseas commanders will comply with the emperor's decision. And Kawabe writes in his diary that he agrees. He doesn't think they'll comply either. And right on cue, 2 of the 3 senior officers overseas, the commander in China and the commander in an area that's really effectively Southeast Asian part of the Pacific, both announced that they will not comply with the surrender order, even from the emperor. What happens then is that the emperor had anticipated that this might well happen. He'd ordered the preparation of 2 proclamations. One became famous was the one he broadcast, or at least he recorded a record that was broadcast on August 15th, 1945, announcing to the Japanese people that the war would end. In that broadcast, by the way, the emperor never uses the word defeat or surrender. But the emperor had anticipated, based on a long and sad history for over 15 years of the indiscipline and outright mutiny of the Imperial Army, that he would have to try to personally convince the armed forces to surrender. He had a second proclamation prepared, which, with evidence of the lack of compliance, was issued on the 17th of August, and that, plus the fact that the emperor sent princes, imperial princes, as personal representatives to these overseas commanders, eventually secured the surrender of these Japanese overseas forces. So, in sum, what you can see is what I indicated at first. When you look at the total number of deaths in the Asia-Pacific War, it is indeed a titanic tragedy, one of the greatest in human history. And when we look at how the war ended, we can see just how incredibly contingent it was that we got a Japanese government to surrender, and then we got the Japanese armed forces to comply with that surrender. And there were many a step along the way in which things might have gone differently. So let me finish by taking us back to where we began. This is the original title image, and behind the words were this image. And when you see this image, and when you saw the image originally, I think most of you must have thought, well, this is an image from Hiroshima or Nagasaki. Well, the reality is, this is Manila in February 1945, after a horrific battle in which Japanese forces conducted a suicidal struggle to the death, in the course of which they killed tens of thousands of Filipinos, perhaps as many as 100,000, which is more deaths than the Nagasaki bomb caused. Now, let me pause for a moment and take us back to that question that was posed at the beginning of this discussion. And now look at the answers that are offered and see whether your answer now would change in response to this question. So this image is a reminder of what the Asia-Pacific War really was all about. It's an event of enormous consequence. It's an event of enormous tragedy. And must never forget just how contingent that outcome was. Thank you very much.